Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, from time to time, you know I like to take a look at alternate history. I think it's a very unique way, a unique lens through which to view actual historical events by kind of playing out the scenarios of what might have happened if one or two things had gone a different way. It just allows us to see the importance of those events as they unfolded. But there are also times when people say that certain alternate history scenarios are just dumb. An alternate history hub who makes a living out of talking about alternate history did a video that we did a reaction to back in early August called 10 Dumb Alternate Scenarios. And now he's got another one out that came out a couple of weeks ago called 10 More Dumb Alternate Scenarios. So we're going to be taking a look at that today. I'll put the link in the description to the original video if you want to check out a channel that has a lot of great content centered around the idea of alternate history. This is the place for you. I will also pin in the comment section down below my reaction to the original 10 Dumb Alternate History Scenarios. Let's dive into this one.
As it turns out, there are a lot of dumb alternate history topics. Or at least there are a lot more than 10. So since you all enjoyed the last time I did this, how about we talk about 10 more dumb alternate scenarios. Once again, we're gonna do this chronologically. Honestly, I get the appeal for this. You have two completely different worlds clashing with each other. As for the winner, they get to define the foundations of Europe for centuries to come.
Fair.
But is that really the case? Hannibal is a one-in-a-million general who combined elephants with the best military mind to ever take the battlefield. Yet Rome is a one-in-a-million state. Hannibal could defeat them, hell, maybe even destroy Rome itself, but he could never beat them. The problem—
That's actually a great point. I want to let him play this out, but if I was thinking of anything to say about this, that would be what I would say.
Here isn't Hannibal, it's Carthage. This scenario poses two questions. The first being, could a military expedition, detached from supplies and reinforcements at home, take down Rome as an away team? The simple answer is no. The more impossible task, however, is the second question. A more impossible task is, could Carthage take Rome's place?
And my issue with the alternate history scenario that he's laying out here is not that a army could not march into Rome or a place like Rome and defeat it, detached from base of supply and things like that. That happened many times in history where an army was far from its base of supply and was able to defeat another power. The issue in this case, to me, is less about Carthage and more about the nature of Rome. Any other not an empire, any other republic facing the situation that Rome was facing at the time of the Punic Wars would have lost, and would have lost big. The issue was that Rome didn't know how to lose at that time anyway. I mean, they took a beating that should have defeated anybody, but they were so unwilling to lose that they were willing to suffer just catastrophic losses to their military age population in order to win. And that was something Carthage couldn't account for. Few people could account for, because nobody had ever really faced anything like that.
And even more interesting, and even more definitive, no. What used to be a Phoenician colony was now a maritime city-state with a corrupted oligarchy set on becoming a mercantile superpower. The Punic Wars showed Carthage in its prime against a Rome which was filled with dreams and ambition. This was the—
It's only Carthage in its— and listen, I get it. This is alternate history. There's really no right or wrong. This is all about opinion. This is all about what people think. So there's no right or wrong. So when I'm pushing back against him, please understand I'm just trying to play devil's advocate. I'm not saying he's wrong any more than I'm saying I'm right. It's all opinion. Carthage is in its prime because it didn't go anywhere from there. If Rome had been defeated, we would have said that Rome was in its prime. The only reason it's not in its prime is because we know what it ended up being. We don't know what Carthage would have ended up being.
The extent of what Carthage could do, and they bottled a naval war against an enemy who couldn't even build a fleet. And once they did, they lost it to a storm, twice. Carthage was a state that won 3 of the most decisive battles in antiquity, yet still lost the war. Making modifications in Italy or at Zama wouldn't alter the timeline in any significant way, and even if it did, it would be inconceivable to imagine Rome losing. Rome just always had the population to bounce back. Carthage, which relied on mercenaries, didn't. Rome
wasn't that big and populous yet at that point. This was more about Rome being willing to sacrifice the population that they had.
Managed to come back every single time. And it just so happened to be that the way that Rome ruled Italy was much more stable for nation building than the way that Carthage did.
That's true, absolutely
Carthage
true.
could never pull off what Rome did. Not in the courts, not in the battlefield, or in the sea, or in the forum. Nor could Athens, Sparta, Syracuse, or Pella. Carthage was...
I do agree with them 100% that Rome was uniquely structured to be able to sustain its continued growth the way that it did.
was not Rome, and it never would be. It's funny that one of the most amazing scenarios revolving around Justinian, the most popular one in fact, just happens to be one of the dumbest. Seriously, you got stuff like what if the Black Death killed him or was postponed? What if Theodora didn't save him during the Nika riots or convinced him to focus on the East? There is so much potential here. But nah, let's do a cookie cutter impossible to achieve Roman reunification run. Why not? To be fair, Justinian had the administrative and military capabilities to get the job done. Additionally, if the reunion was to happen, this was the time to do it.
Yeah.
It had only been a half a century since the fall of the West. So let's relegate this from being...
And let's look back to a recent video we did where we were looking at stories of betrayal, where the West was doing all right very near to the end when it fell. And an act of betrayal kind of cost it its last-ditch attempt to survive under a decent emperor.
An actual dumb scenario to a slightly improbable one, on account of the fact that... Psych! Sorry, Roma Booze. Had you going there for a second,
Roma Booze?
but now it's time to shatter your dreams. The Latin-speaking West, which had nowhere near the resources the East possessed, was in an abysmal state. With how defiant the Vandals and Ostrogoths were, you can pretty much take out the RE and call it for what it was, a conquest. The church divisions were already apparent. And even if Justinian didn't have an incredibly competent enemy to the east, his hold over Italy and Spain would be short-lived. And then there's the disasters. A year before he ascended the throne, the Byzantines were struck by arguably the worst earthquake in human history. The 526 Antioch earthquake wiped out 80% of the empire's third largest city.
Yeah, that said, why can't there be an alternate history scenario where the earthquake doesn't happen? Yeah, I mean, any of the things that he's laying out here, like the plague and the earthquake, these are things that could be your diverging points, right?
It off the map, alongside 250,000 people. That's over 1% of the entire empire's population. Just 2 years later, another, but milder earthquake destroyed what was left standing, alongside the buildings under construction. The Nika riot fires engulfed Constantinople, destroying much of it, including the church, upon which Justinian later built Hagia Sophia. In 536, the eruption of the Krakatoa
the worst year in history
volcano impacted the entire world, causing severe famine throughout the empire.
But if it impacted the entire world, then it's not giving any inherent disadvantage to Justinian's empire more than it is anyone else.
Up here, you can easily call this one of the unluckiest reigns ever, but just when you think it's over, bam, the plague. The bubonic plague lasted from 541 to 549, and coincided with yet another earthquake, this time in Constantinople, wiping out 25 to 50% of the empire's 25 million population. This was a disaster that the Byzantines didn't recover from for centuries. So yeah, Justinian was truly S tier for coming out on top of this, despite having a bad draw. But he was just in charge at the worst time. To create a timeline where Justinian achieves his dream, we would have to reverse plagues, earthquakes, centuries of cultural differences, pacify an enemy, and break the very rules of biology just for the Byzantines to take back Rome.
I'll give him credit on all of that one. I can agree with him from the standpoint that these external factors would have made it really, really hard to try and unify when he's doing all he can just to hold what he's got together. So I get that. I can't argue with that.
Sorry. So I made a mistake. The mistake of talking about World War II on YouTube. A great sin. One that the YouTube gods punished me dearly for. Oh boy, a YouTuber complaining about demonetization. What else is new? Punished for wanting to talk about World War II on a history channel. And I still want to talk about World War II. Or
he's 100% right, though. And if you didn't see my recent video on this, look for my video that I did a while back on censorship. Yes, it's a little clickbaity in saying that YouTube's censoring history, but if you listen to what I said, it's absolutely true.
Any other topic, regardless of what YouTube says. So that's where Patreon comes in. By joining the Patreon, you get access to monthly exclusive videos whose topic is voted by you. Stuff that might never see the light of day on YouTube. Over the last year, in fact, we've built up a catalog of exclusive videos that you've never heard of. Britain and France declare war on the Russian Empire. Germany, who is allied with the Russians, declares war back. Austro-Hungary declares war on Germany, and in response, Italy declares war on the Habsburgs. The Patreon's been going on for a little bit, and I thank everyone who has contributed. Alright.
Yeah, and as I say repeatedly, would not be able to do the things that I do on this channel without the incredible support that we have through Patreon and through YouTube memberships. And so, whether it's me or anybody else, any of your favorite content creators, if you are in a position to do something, even if it's a very small level of support on Patreon, I promise you it makes a huge difference to those creators.
Self-sponsor over. Vikings. Vikings. In America. Discovering North America centuries before Columbus. You know, by accident. What if they just stayed? Could we have seen an alternate colonization of North America, but with Scandinavians instead? Well, you see, there are a lot of different...
Did Columbus really discover North America, though? I mean, discovered the Caribbean islands and some of South America, right?
Between the Vikings finding America and the Spanish. The conquistadors were backed by a centralized state, willing to invest in these new lands. The Vikings essentially stumbled upon Newfoundland, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly overflowing with gold. Even for future
No, but that wasn't the Vikings' point. I mean, they colonized places like Iceland and Greenland.
Europeans who wielded far superior technology than the Norse. Colonization wasn't easy. Plus, the very way the Vikings interacted with Newfoundland, or Vinland as they called it, was far different than future colonists. This was not a settlement for expanding influence. It was kind of a gathering point for resources. The barest of resources: wood, beaver pelts, and grapes. For the Norse, settlements weren't always seen as permanent endeavors. They could always be temporary. Another stopping point on the sea. And if it...
Yeah, which is, to me, why it would have been possible for them to do that, because they weren't after the same things. They weren't looking to build a permanent presence where they would be shipping back natural resources to a mother country like Spain or England did.
Just wasn't in the cards. They would simply leave. They weren't gonna live and die for the sake of holding some land like future European settlers would.
Well,
Plus, it's important to remember that the Norse were particularly vulnerable to being absorbed by local populations, as seen in England, Normandy, and Sicily. With resistance from the locals, scarce food supplies, and distance from Europe, the Viking settlement would have been doomed from the start. Vinland would likely never have grown large enough to serve as a stepping stone for future colonies. Even if the Vikings actually...
No, but that's not what we're saying, right? I mean, if we're saying colonize America, it doesn't necessarily mean go manifest destiny and fill all of America. You could have a colony, you could have a settlement. They could have maybe taken up all of that island that they were on, or that part of Canada.
Actually did want to stay there. Italia, the cradle of Roman law, seat of the papacy.
When you guys are watching this, that's where I'll be.
Home to Da Vinci, Galileo, And of course, pizza, or at least what they call pizza. Hey, why not add nationalism to the list? After all, Machiavelli's The Prince became foundational to the study of political science and realpolitik. Aren't the Italian cities a form of mini-states in themselves? Venice was able to play ball with the big boys, even taking one of them out, while the Medici founded a large part of what we consider culturally the Renaissance. Yeah, the Medici were powerful. They held Florence in the palm of their hand. And
in Florence, let me tell you what, maybe when you're watching this, that's where I'll be, is in Florence. Florence is one of the coolest cities I've ever been to. The history there and the just that Renaissance architecture, it's incredible. It's a really, really cool place. If you're ever in Italy, do not miss Florence.
They turned it into an incredibly strong state. So why couldn't Florence have been the one to unite Italy, instead of Savoy centuries later? Well, here's the thing. Nobody could have brought all these flavors into one dish.
I agree.
Not even Lorenzo the Magnificent. They had to be forced together by a future Corsican general who had a deep desire to redraw borders. Prior to the Italian republics...
That said, if Napoleon was able to do it, why couldn't someone else, I guess, is the question, right? I agree with what he's saying. Like I said, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I agree with what he's saying, that this was a hodgepodge of very different places and would have been really hard to unify. And I agree that probably under the Medici it wasn't going to happen. But if Napoleon could do it, maybe someone else could too.
It was the cities, hell, neighborhoods, that formed a unique identity, one which trickled into Europe over the course of centuries. This was the only place in Europe which had rejected autocratic dynasties and papal theocracy, forging an intense level of local cultural identity. It came in many forms, but none of which we'd call Italian. Every city had distinct dialects, which others didn't comprehend, something which remains true in many places to this day. Different customs, style of government, ideologies with strong influences from the French, Spanish, Austrian, and even Arabic world. While Venetian, Milanese, Florentine, Pisan, and Sienese were the very first clear identities in Europe, ironically the Italian unification was the last and most difficult compared to the rest.
That's true, but Italy had been unified at times, as we've talked about already with Napoleon. But yeah, the final unification, kind of the modern one, it's pretty much in line with the history of Germany.
While other European countries also have several regional dialects, Italy, despite being about the same size, has 30 to 40, more than the rest combined. Long story short, even to this day, Italy is still divided. It certainly wouldn't have been unified in the 15th century.
I would love to hear, I know we have an Italian audience on this channel, I'd love in particular to hear from you. What do you think about everything he just said about the differing dialects? I don't think dialect is a big deal because you go to England and they've got dozens of different dialects depending on where you are too. So I'm not sure I agree with the fact that he said that Italy has more than all the other nations combined. Not sure that's true, but I'd love to hear from Italians on that one.
So fun fact, many of you actually voted for this scenario. That prompted me to sit down and dig into the event that most people only know about because of that dumb mask. But did you know, that dumb mask almost committed the biggest terrorist attack in human history?
Born in
potentially.
New York.
I mean, it didn't happen, so we don't really know, but...
The funny thing is, though, that we talk all about Guy Fawkes as if he was somehow the main guy in all this, but he was just one little piece of a much larger conspiracy.
Could have been a lot bigger than you probably thought. Remember the 5th of November indeed. It seemed like a great scenario to explore at first, but once you dig deeper, you see, Guy Fawkes, the cartoonish villain the British monarchy forever curses the name of, wasn't even the ringleader of the plot. A plot which failed due to a simple delay. So what if that gunpowder plot had succeeded? What if the plan went off without a hitch? Well, the plan was to stack 36 barrels of gunpowder beneath the British Parliament and blow it up as the king and his family were visiting. Do you know how big of an explosion 36 barrels of gunpowder can make? I do. Like, if this actually happened, it would have been like that one scene from Game of Thrones, but probably bigger. Parliament itself would be obliterated, taking the lives of King James I, his son Prince Henry, every member of the House of Lords, many from the House of Commons, even high-ranking bishops, plus potentially anything in a 2-block radius, all annihilated. This is like taking out the White House, Congress, and Supreme Court at the same time. Sounds like an event that would have major repercussions. Yeah, you'd think. The goal of the plot was to revert England back to Catholicism, and oftentimes that's kind of the overall idea for this alternate scenario. Like, destroying the government would somehow install a Catholic monarch back into power. But here's the thing, after the brutally repressive reign of Elizabeth, that ship had already sailed.
Not sure I'd go so far as to call Elizabeth's reign brutally repressive. Elizabeth was very much about freedom of conscience. That didn't necessarily play out in terms of legalization of varying theological perspectives. So, Catholics didn't have the same freedom to worship openly and to belong to their church that people in the Church of England did. But I wouldn't say she was like her sister and kind of brutally suppressing anyone who was Catholic. And there had been, just even in the previous decades, Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth and put a Catholic on the throne.
Barely anyone showed support for the plot, even British Catholics. This was a group of men who wanted to commit a terrorist attack and had no follow-up. They had no plan, no backing. The only hope was that once the attack actually happened, the country would rally behind them. But I don't think that rally would ever come. Even the failed plot led to a massive wave of anti-Catholic reprisals, so really no change here.
Well, it did, but that's because the Protestant monarch remained on the throne and the Protestant Parliament remained alive. If all of that changes, first of all, the question I would have is, if the king and his immediate family are killed, who becomes the monarch? Because James I of England, James VI of Scotland, is already Elizabeth dies and she's the third of Henry VIII's children to die. And so now you have to go back to Elizabeth's father's sister, who is the great-grandmother of James I, to get the next heir to the throne. So I guess you'd have to go back to one of the other siblings, one of the other sisters, or the other sister, which had been where they'd gotten Lady Jane Grey, who was also Protestant. So I'm wondering if there is a Catholic who would be in line to inherit at that point. Okay, so the plan was to put Elizabeth Stuart on the throne. She was the daughter of James I, who eventually becomes Queen of Bohemia. And it is eventually through her line that we will get the later monarchy in the UK through Queen Anne and then through the Hanover dynasty. So all the future monarchs eventually did come through Elizabeth, but she was young enough at that point that they would have captured her, that were going to make Henry Percy the regent, and then forcibly raise Elizabeth as a Catholic. But at this point, the Catholics are a significant minority in England. So I do tend to agree with him on this one, having thought and studied through it a little bit more, that the successful wiping out of all of these folks would have still made things difficult. But it just really, there's so much up in the air about this that I can't bash it completely.
The biggest change is really the death of James I, but he would have been succeeded by another one of his many sons.
There you go.
The house
well, if they had killed his son as well, though.
First, but he would have been succeeded by another one of his many.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point, you have Charles I, who would have been like a couple years old, but if he had been present and been killed, then yeah, I don't know. But yeah, they were going to go after Elizabeth and make her the new queen. Of course, his son Henry was still alive at that point, so actually, Henry would have been king at that point.
Many sons, while the House of Lords would have just been filled up with newly selected members. London would rebuild, like it did many times before. I mean, this isn't even close to the greatest disasters London's ever had. This ain't no Great Fire of 1666. Restoring its seat of government would be no big deal. Does the plot make England Catholic? No. Does it alter its place in the world or its standing with other nations? Not at all. Revolutions often begin with big bangs, but they need a follow-up too. They need support from within either the upper or lower classes, and this would have neither. So, let's do a 180. Let's talk about a scenario which attempts to prevent an unstoppable force by removing one small bang.
Franz Ferdinand. Yeah.
So Franz Ferdinand's driver doesn't get lost in Sarajevo, and the Archduke never gets assassinated. What comes next? The progressive Ferdinand would most likely inherit the throne 2 years later, and institute much-needed reform.
Yeah, so remember, Franz Joseph has been on the throne since, what, 1848? I mean, he's been there forever. And his nephew was significantly more progressive. It would have definitely moved things further in the right direction as far as the plotters were concerned. And I do agree that there's a powder keg in Europe that's going to go off in some way, at some form. But if it's not in the scenario that actually caused World War I, the war might still look different, even though there still probably would have been one.
Autonomy to the minority groups in Austro-Hungary. But even if he was to do that, and his military cabinet just ran with it, does that undo the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War, the one that made the Tsar super ambitious? Do the relations between Britain and Germany smooth over after the Boer War? How about the Moroccan crisis of 1905 and 1911, which isolated Germany and united the British and French? Or the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, which saw the Ottomans lose Libya?
And the Balkan
balance
Wars.
of power was quickly fading. Russia and the Ottomans were on the brink of revolution. Germany was feeling that its win streak was starting to fade, and Britain was concerned about its empire. Italy had so much to prove. In the late 1800s,
Italy wanted territory from Austria-Hungary as well.
Alliances were in constant flux.
Yeah.
But since Bismarck left office, they were starting to take firm shape. Every war cabinet in Europe wanted war. Above all else, you can't really ignore the two Balkan Wars, representing the biggest shift in the status quo in Europe since 1871. Not to mention, Europe was being hit by the biggest wave of anarchist movements, which claimed numerous heads of state. The arms race was
we forget about all those assassinations
of anarchist
that
movements, which claimed numerous
Umberto of Italy, Alexander of Serbia, Grand Duke Sergei of Russia, Carlos I of Portugal, Jose Canelles, Prime Minister of Spain, and George I of Greece.
Heads of state. The arms race was on, and everyone wanted to give industrialized warfare a try, because everyone, and I do mean everyone in Europe, either felt that this was their chance to climb the ladder or preserve their place on top. It's a great point of divergence, just not one that prevents World War I. For that, you have to look further back. I actually did a video on what if Bismarck was assassinated in 1866, and that one just throws everything into chaos.
Yeah, that absolutely would. If you change the unification of Germany as we know it, and the Franco-Prussian War, which ends the last French Empire, that's a dramatic reversal in the future of Europe.
So yeah, oil, the black gold, the thing every major power ran on. It was not evenly distributed across the world. In 1940, the United States produced more oil than the rest of the world combined, sitting at 180 million tons. Next came Venezuela, and then the Soviet Union. Then Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, and Romania. Germany used a very costly process converting coal into synthetic oil, which was less efficient, and it caused their deep desire for the Caucasus. The Japanese, though, had all of their eggs in the American basket. If you think about it, this means that the Sino-Japanese war effort ran on American oil.
Yeah, that's true, and that's what, I know where he's going with this, is what led to the war crisis. But that's something Japan should have thought of before they decided to start trying to create their greater East Asian coast prosperity sphere. Is that, hey, maybe the United States might not like us using all their oil for our war machine that's killing hundreds of thousands of people.
Every bomber, every ship depended on this oil trade. Hirohito had 6 months of oil in stock, so when America hit Japan with an embargo in June 1941, wouldn't you know it, Japan hit America in Pearl Harbor that December. There is no conceivable reality where Japan does not attack everything in the Pacific after the embargo. The timing of the embargo could be moved a bit, but the attack on British Malay for the rubber, Dutch East Indies for the oil, and America for naval dominance.
Yeah, it's 100%. It's a resource grab. The same thing that people argue is the motivation behind Hitler invading Russia, which had much more to do with ideology than it did to do with oil, but that's another story.
Is guaranteed. Now, what you could do to change things a little bit is have Lexington and Enterprise present for the attack, or blow up the fuel tanks. But so what? The war is prolonged. Some ships from the Atlantic are moved to the Pacific. How that theater unfolds would be exactly the same. Japan's disorganized...
I agree with him that certain scenarios, like he said, them actually hitting the really hard, like the really important targets in Pearl Harbor, Midway, things like that. They don't change the outcome of the war, they just prolong it.
Army structure and overextended economy could never compete with American production. Nobody could. America's plan for invading Japan would not be enacted for the exact same reason as in our timeline. While we're at it, as inevitable as the embargo and Japanese hostility is, the war against Germany is just as inevitable. So, you got a group of hardline communist leaders attempting to seize the Soviet government, who managed to place Gorbachev under house arrest and declare martial law. But 3 days later, the plotters failed, and just 3 months later, the Union was dissolved.
Yep,
Alright,
I remember
so in
this.
this alternate scenario, have the coup succeed and all is well, right? The Soviet Union is saved. Here's the thing. While the Soviet Union might have been preserved, this was not the event or time to do it.
No, and you have to go back much further. I mean, this is one of those things that just has inevitability written all over it. By the time this all goes down, the collapse of the Soviet Union had become a foregone conclusion. It was just a matter of when.
2 years earlier, Berlin had fallen. The Soviets were humiliated in Afghanistan. They lost the space race. They needed American grain to feed their people, and many republics were ready to go to war if it broke out. Most importantly, the Russian leader Boris Yeltsin stood firmly against the coup.
Yep.
The Russian people marched out in mass protests against them. Even the military was against this move.
You can't have a coup without the military on your side.
The whole house is burning down, and you decide to go in, hoping to save it by frantically blowing on the flames with your mouth. You stand there, cheeks puffed out, sweating profusely, yelling, "Don't worry, I got this," as the flames grow higher. That's what the scenario feels like.
I agree.
Making alterations to Lenin's succession, Khrushchev's reforms, Brezhnev's stagnation, the Sino-Soviet split, the Afghan invasion, Chernobyl, hell, even the space race could probably have led to an interesting scenario where the Soviets' lifespan is extended, but this ain't it.
100% agree with him on all of that.
Frankly, we most likely live in a timeline which saw a prolonged, limping Soviet Union collapsing on its last leg. Despite all of its natural reserves, it ran out of gas a long time ago. So these last two are less scenarios and more of just templates. Topics that I've done many times. I am guilty of this, and I'll keep doing it. Try to stop me. There's nothing wrong.
I love how he owned it. He's like, this is a ridiculous scenario, but I'm going to keep doing them anyway.
About thinking about if X empire never fell. It's a classic hypothetical. It's also not really plausible at all. Imagine every change you would need to keep the Roman Empire afloat. Yeah, let's say everything just goes perfect.
No, I don't know that you do, though. I mean, you just gotta not have emperors dying over and over and over and over and over again. Bring back the Republic, a republic that actually functions, and maybe it lasts longer. I mean, there's obviously so many unknowns in all of that, but man, it took so many generations of really bad, corrupt leadership for the Roman Empire to fall.
Perfectly for Rome. All the issues that compounded just go away, or they aren't as bad. That's great. That's perfect. But it also makes things very difficult to predict. Because what is Roman history if not just documenting the problems that unfolded upon Rome? The issues Rome faced is what shaped Rome. So to imagine a world where it all goes perfectly is entertaining, but it can't really be considered plausible.
I don't think it had to go perfectly. I just think it had to go anything but terribly with its leadership.
Basically fanfiction, the equivalent of a kid just going, I have no weaknesses, I win, which isn't how any empire or nation works, because empires have enemies, other kids playing the game too, and each player responds to the actions of every other player. If you have one empire just be perfect, it just snowballs the entire scenario, changes the world in ways that no one can predict. I wouldn't wish having to imagine this scenario on anyone. To keep track of all the players on the map and how they'd change if an empire didn't fall or things stayed the same? Oh god. I guess what I'm getting at here is that if, say, Rome never fell, we would not have a world that looked like this. A stereotypical, classical Rome, one stuck in time.
Well, no, because they would have advanced. I mean, the technology, I think, would have been really interesting.
We would have a Rome that would be entirely alien to us.
Yeah.
Rome itself changed drastically from the ancient days of the Republic to its final end in Constantinople.
That's true, and I guess what he's probably saying is, rather than the Roman Empire never falling being somehow plausible, it's just such a big scenario that it's not worth taking on because there's so many things. And so many variables involved. I get that.
What it even would be entirely depends on the challenges it faced. Hell, even the typical Roman soldier we imagine changed in appearance. When Rome fell, the average Roman soldier didn't look like this at all.
Yeah.
He looked like this. Something closer to what we imagine as a medieval foot soldier. So even if we imagine a world where Rome just continued on, what Rome would even look like or act like would be completely alien.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how that empire's history would have been.
But that's what alternate history is all about, is trying to play out those scenarios, right? I get what he's saying, though. It's such a big, long scenario that it's probably not even worth attempting.
Imagine if America collapsed after the end of the Revolution. Not reclaimed by Britain, but it just kind of disappeared or something. In some alternate world, you'd have a nerd imagining a world where the United States continued on, and the only thing they'd have to go off of is revolutionary America. They would probably imagine a place that we would call stuck in time. Their alternate 2024 America might be a place where men in powdered wigs would go tally-ho and fire their muskets at the British. They might imagine a United States that would become a Jeffersonian dream, because...
Yeah, and so basically what we're dealing with then is that you can't play out an alternate history scenario for hundreds of years. Once we get out 10, 20, 30 years from an event, there's so many variables that we just don't know what would happen.
That's what the founder wanted. They could never imagine that America would ever become a military superpower, or would have cities as big as New York or LA. You get my point? My point is that if X empire never fell, even if it somehow continued on for hundreds or thousands of more years, it would not look like the empire we recognized at all. A world without gunpowder, no printing press, no electricity, steam, or nukes. A world where a major scientific discovery just doesn't happen, or an invention is never invented. Cool. What now? While I can't help myself, and will do an Empire Never Falling video from time to time, I try to avoid the whole what if X was never invented thing. I'm older and wiser now. Because what happens in a world where something isn't invented? It just isn't invented. Like, for example...
Right, but then eventually somebody invents it, because if there's a need for something like the light bulb, there was a need for that. It was going to be invented in some form or another.
A world where electricity never exists. Yes, a scenario where there is just no electricity, it is not invented. Pretty much means the last century didn't happen. What would the 20th century be like without electricity? There just isn't the 20th century as we know it.
Right.
Like, what do you even say about that? It's completely unrecognizable. What if we went back further? No printing press. The very way books are created and how information is spread is entirely stuck in the days of medieval scribes copying every last letter. How do you imagine that world? It's kind of like an inverse of the last section. If an empire continued forever, it would be unrecognizable, and any era from the last 500 years without the printing press would be pretty unrecognizable as well. Now, while this sucks for realism, it does make for pretty good fiction. Steampunk worlds where steam power has become the main source of energy, galactic empires that don't use computers but people instead, or maybe you're Bretonia and just stick to the whole medieval knight thing in a world of gunpowder for some reason. You can make alterations where certain breakthroughs happen sooner or are delayed, but imagining a timeline where nobody, anywhere, at any time stumbles upon these achievements just doesn't really work.
Like I said, certain inventions are just inevitable because the need existed. The printing press is another example. At some point, somebody was going to figure out a way to do that.
At this point, we have to look at a few different civilizations scattered across the globe, all arriving at similar discoveries. Like Newton and Leibniz discovered calculus independently, same for Darwin and Wallace for the theory of evolution. Carl Scheele identified oxygen first, but Joseph Priestley published his findings earlier. In the 1860s, a Russian and a German both discovered the periodic table. Simply removing an inventor from the equation doesn't remove the invention, it only delays the inevitable.
The Wright brothers were not the only people working on airplanes at the time that they did.
It's still fun to think about, though. Ultimately, all these scenarios are just fun to talk about. This whole video is about nitpicking. Don't take it too seriously. Please be nice.
That was all fair. I thought he did a great job with that. And like I said, anywhere I was pushing back, I was just trying to play devil's advocate. There is no right or wrong with this stuff. It's just fun to talk about. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if there's another video from Alternate History Hub you'd like me to look at, let me know. Thanks for watching.